The grand senate of Xylos gleamed under the artificial light of 1,000 suns, its crystalline dome engineered to capture and amplify the radiance of distant stars. I have been observing these proceedings for nearly 2 decades now, watching as the same rituals played out with predictable precision. The Lumina representatives always entered first, their luminescent skin casting a subtle glow that demanded attention. Then came the various ambassadors of the hundreds of species comprising the Galactic Alliance, all of us arranged in careful hierarchies that had been established millennia ago. I am Ambassador Lyra of the Sylvani, a species known for our diplomatic prowess and keen observational skills. The Sylvani are respected, if not particularly feared or revered, within the Alliance. We served as mediators, counselors, and occasionally as the conscience of this vast interstellar community. It was a role that afforded me certain privileges, including the ability to move between different factions with relative ease. Today's session followed the same choreography, as always. Emperor Kalen VII sat upon his elevated throne, the crystalline structure embedded with neural interfaces that connected him to every aspect of the Senate chambers. His elongated features were the epitome of Lumina beauty. Sharp cheekbones, eyes that shifted between silver and violet, depending on his mood, and skin that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously. The elaborate ceremonial robes he wore were woven with materials harvested from dying stars, a conspicuous display of the Empire's reach and resources. Esteemed representatives of the Galactic Alliance, the Emperor's voice resonated through the chamber without the need for amplification, another genetic gift of the Lumina. We gather today to celebrate 5,000 years of prosperity and peace under the enlightened guidance of our shared institutions. I suppressed a sigh. The shared institutions were, of course, predominantly controlled by the Lumina. I exchanged glances with Ambassador Grok of the Gorgon Mining Collective, whose crystalline exoskeleton glinted with barely contained frustration. The Gorgon had recently seen their resource quotas doubled with minimal compensation. My gaze drifted to the empty seats reserved for the Earth delegation. Humans had joined the Alliance a mere 47 years ago, barely a moment in galactic politics. They were considered primitive by most standards, their biological makeup unremarkable, their planetary resources modest. Yet they possessed an astonishing adaptive capability that had allowed them to reverse engineer and improve upon Alliance technology at a rate that clearly unsettled the Lumina. The humans' occasional absence from Senate proceedings was noted, but rarely mentioned. They were still regarded as semi-barbaric upstarts, their colonies at the fringe of Alliance space serving primarily as resource extraction points and strategic buffers against the uncharted regions. Their aggression was both feared and derided in equal measure. Today, Emperor Kalen continued, his tone shifting to what he likely believed sounded warm and paternal. I am pleased to announce the Unified Resource Directive, a new initiative designed to strengthen our collective security and prosperity. The Senate Hall quieted further. New imperial directives were rarely beneficial to non-Lumina worlds. The rapid expansion of our alliance has created inefficiencies and vulnerabilities. To address these concerns, all member worlds, particularly our newer frontier settlements, will increase resource contributions by 100% effective immediately. Murmurs rippled through the assembly. 100% increase was unprecedented. Furthermore, the Emperor continued, either oblivious to or dismissive of the disquiet. All newly developed technologies will undergo a thorough security review by the Lumina High Command before implementation. This is, of course, for our collective safety. I felt my inner leaves curl with dismay. This was nothing short of technological appropriation disguised as security protocol. The directive would particularly impact human colonies, which have been developing innovative adaptations of Alliance technology at remarkable speed. Your Luminance, I said, using the formal address as I activated my speaking channel, the Sylvani delegation respectfully requests clarification on the implementation timeline. Many worlds structure their resource allocation cycles annually, and an immediate doubling would cause significant disruption. The Emperor's eyes shifted toward a colder silver. The security of the alliance cannot wait for convenient fiscal calendars, Ambassador Lyra. Accommodations can be discussed with regional governors, but the directive stands. I nodded deferentially, but my concern deepened. Next to me, Ambassador Grok's crystalline appendages clicked in a pattern that indicated severe agitation. The Gorgon Collective anticipates production difficulties. Grok's translation module rendered his crystal vibrations into the common tongue. Our mining operations are already at capacity based on current quotas. Perhaps the Gorgon should invest in more efficient extraction technologies, suggested Admiral Vash, the Emperor's military commander who stood at rigid attention behind the throne. His tone carried the typical Lumina condescension toward species they considered technologically inferior. The proceedings continued, with various delegates raising concerns that were systematically dismissed or minimized. Throughout it all, I kept glancing at the empty Earth delegation seats. Their absence now seemed less like disinterest and more like deliberate abstention. As the session concluded, I joined Ambassador Grok and a few trusted colleagues in a private discussion chamber. "This directive will devastate the outer colonies," said Representative Thaz of the methane-breathing Vozari. "The humans, in particular, will not accept this quietly." The humans rarely do anything quietly. Grok's crystals chimed with what passed for Gorgon humor. "That is precisely what concerns me," I admitted. "They may be new to interstellar politics, but they have demonstrated remarkable creativity when challenged." "You mean their rebellion on Proxima Centauri?" asked Thaz. That mining dispute was resolved. Resolved after they had already secured control of the asteroid belt and demonstrated their weaponized mining equipment. I reminded them. The Lumina resolution was more of a reluctant compromise than the punishment they intended. We dispersed shortly afterward, each carrying our concerns back to our respective worlds. I transmitted a detailed report to the Sylvani Council, emphasizing the potential for significant unrest, particularly in human-controlled sectors. The response came back quickly. Maintain neutrality. Observe. Report. Standard Sylvani caution. I complied, but privately wondered how long neutrality would remain an option. 3 standard cycles later, the rumors began to reach Xylos. Reports of coordinated protests across human colonies. Production halts. Communication disruptions. The Emperor responded predictably, dispatching the royal fleet under Admiral Vash to restore order to the Earth territories. The next Senate session was marked by tension so thick it seemed to distort the very air of the chamber. Emperor Kalen VII stood at the central podium rather than remaining seated on his throne, a rare occurrence that signaled the importance of the address. "Esteemed representatives," he began, his skin pulsing with light that betrayed his agitation despite his measured tone. "I come before you today to address the unfortunate circumstances unfolding in the Earth territories." The Earth delegation seats remained conspicuously empty. Our generous incorporation of humanity into our alliance has been met with ingratitude and rebellion. Despite our patient guidance, Earth colonies have systematically violated resource agreements and engaged in unauthorized technological development. The Emperor's light pulsed brighter. "However, I am pleased to report that the royal fleet under the command of our esteemed Admiral Vash has reached the primary human settlements. Order will be restored swiftly and with minimal disruption to Alliance operations." A wave of discomfort passed through the Senate. Minimal disruption was a euphemism well understood throughout the Alliance. It typically meant military action significant enough to crush resistance, but controlled enough to preserve valuable infrastructure. "The humans will learn," the Emperor continued, "as all species eventually do, that the protection and prosperity offered by the Lumina Empire comes with responsibilities." There! A thunderous crash interrupted the Emperor mid-sentence. The massive ceremonial doors of the Senate chamber, designed never to be closed during session as a symbol of the Alliance's perpetual openness, had been violently forced open. In the doorway stood a figure in a tattered uniform. Human, female, of average height for their species, but projecting an intensity that seemed to fill the vast chamber. Her face was streaked with what I recognized as the red blood of her species. One arm hung at an awkward angle suggesting severe injury, and her uniform, which I recognized as Earth Defense Force, was torn and scorched. But it was what, or rather who, she dragged behind her that caused a collective gasp to echo through the Senate Hall. Admiral Vash, the feared commander of the Royal Fleet, supreme enforcer of the Emperor's will across 1,000 worlds, lay unconscious, his ornate armor shattered, his luminescent skin dimmed to a sickly gray. The human officer held him by what remained of his ceremonial collar, pulling his considerable weight across the polished floor of the Senate with what must have been augmented strength. "Captain Eva Rostova, Earth Defense Force," she announced, her voice hoarse but carrying through the stunned silence. "I believe this belongs to you." She released Admiral Vash, who collapsed in an undignified heap at the base of the central platform. The Lumina guards stationed around the perimeter finally overcame their shock and moved forward, weapons drawn. Emperor Kalen VII raised a hand, halting them. His curiosity, perhaps the defining trait of the Lumina, despite their arrogance, had been piqued. "You show remarkable audacity, human," the Emperor said, his voice betraying a mixture of anger and genuine surprise. "Explain yourself before I have you executed for this unprecedented breach of Senate security." Captain Rostova straightened herself despite her obvious injuries. "Your royal fleet entered Earth territory with hostile intent. We defended ourselves. One human with a damaged uniform defeated the royal fleet?" The Emperor's tone was mocking. "Your species' tendency toward exaggeration is well documented." "Not defeated," Rostova corrected, her gaze unwavering. "Neutralized. Your ships are intact, but disabled. Your crews are unharmed, but contained." Admiral Vash here insisted on personally leading a boarding party against our command vessel. Her lips curved in what humans called a smile, but contained no warmth. That was his mistake. The Emperor's skin flared with light, a sign of rage among the Lumina. The Royal Fleet consists of 50 capital ships and over 200 support vessels. You expect this Senate to believe. "I don't particularly care what this Senate believes," Rostova interrupted, committing yet another shocking breach of protocol. "What matters is what happened. Your fleet encountered something they weren't prepared for. Something your intelligence failed to detect during your decades of studying us while pretending to be our allies." She reached into a pocket and withdrew a small device. Immediately, every weapon in the chamber was trained on her. "Relax," she said. "If I wanted to attack, I wouldn't have bothered with this theatrical entrance." She activated the device. Rather than an explosion or attack, the Senate's massive display screens, normally showing ceremonial imagery or data relevant to proceedings, suddenly flickered and changed. The screens now displayed what appeared to be tactical data. Ships, recognizably the distinctive arrowhead design of the Royal Fleet, drifting powerless in space. Interior footage showing Lumina crew members conscious but contained behind energy barriers. Engineering diagrams of a device I didn't recognize, but which appeared to generate some form of localized field effect. "An electromagnetic pulse weapon?" asked one of the technical advisors to the Korean delegation, their appendages twitching with scientific curiosity despite the tense situation. "Something like that," Rostova replied, "though considerably more sophisticated than a simple EMP. We call it a nullifier. It selectively targets specific energy signatures, particularly those used in Lumina propulsion and weapon systems." The Emperor's composure was rapidly deteriorating. "This is an act of war against the Alliance." "No," Rostova countered. "This is self-defense against an act of war by the Lumina Empire. An important distinction." She turned to address the wider Senate, one that many of you might want to consider, given how often the Emperor's peacekeeping fleets visit your worlds when you question resource quotas or technology restrictions. Murmurs spread through the chamber. The human was giving voice to thoughts many had harbored privately for generations, but never dared express publicly. "Enough of this absurdity," the Emperor snapped. "Guards, Remove this human and place her under arrest. We will determine the full extent of Earth's treachery and respond accordingly." The Lumina royal guards moved forward with purpose, their crystalline armor gleaming. Captain Rostova didn't retreat. Instead, she touched another control on her device. The screens throughout the Senate changed again. This time, they displayed something far more shocking than disabled warships. Ancient records, historical documents, archaeological findings, data streams that appear to be decrypted from long-buried archives. "While you were busy underestimating us as primitive newcomers," Rostova explained, her voice cutting through the growing commotion, "we were busy exploring. One of our archaeological teams discovered something interesting on an abandoned world in what you call the Forbidden Sector. The Emperor had gone completely still, his luminescence dimmed to almost nothing. A repository," Rostova continued. "A complete historical archive of the original Galactic Republic that existed before the Lumina Empire. The civilization that you claimed to have uplifted and guided for millennia. The screens showed evidence that was impossible to dismiss. Ancient starships with technology remarkably similar to current Lumina designs. Historical records of a democratic interstellar republic that had thrived for thousands of years. And most damning, detailed accounts of the Lumina Rebellion, the systematic destruction of historical records, and the rewriting of galactic history. The great Lumina Empire," Rostova's voice dripped with contempt, "builders of the Alliance, guardians of civilization, is nothing more than the successful remnant of a military coup. You didn't create this civilization. You hijacked it, erased its history, and have been parasitizing its achievements for thousands of years." Complete chaos erupted in the Senate chamber. Species that had been part of the Alliance for millennia were confronted with evidence that their entire understanding of history was a fabrication. Ancient rivalries suddenly made sense. Technological restrictions could now be seen as deliberate suppression rather than protection. Emperor Kalen VII finally found his voice. "These are forgeries, clever human manipulations designed to sow division within our alliance." "Are they?" Rostova challenged. "Your own scientists can verify the age of these artifacts. The linguistic patterns are consistent with pre-Empire records. The technological schematics explain gaps in your own engineering that your scientists have never been able to resolve." She stepped closer to the Emperor's platform, ignoring the guards who seemed uncertain whether to intervene without a direct command. "But that's not even the most interesting part," she continued, her voice lowering slightly, forcing the Senate to quiet to hear her. "The most interesting part is what we found about the Lumina themselves." New images appeared on the screens. Biological data, genetic sequences, comparative analyses. "You aren't even the original Lumina," Rostova revealed. "The true Lumina were the scientist caste of the Old Republic. You're their creations, genetic constructs designed for combat and intimidation during the war that destroyed the Republic. You didn't overthrow your masters. You exterminated them and took their name." The Emperor's control finally shattered completely. "Kill her," he screamed at his guards. "Kill her now and prepare the planet killers. Earth will be reduced to ash for this treachery." But the guards hesitated. The revelations had shaken even their conditioned loyalty. More importantly, ambassadors from dozens of powerful worlds had moved to stand near Captain Rostova, creating a living barrier. I found myself among them, though I couldn't recall making the conscious decision to move. Ambassador Grok stood beside me, his crystalline structure vibrating at a frequency that indicated both agitation and resolve. Rostova ignored the Emperor's outburst and continued addressing the Senate. "Earth doesn't seek to destroy the Alliance. We believe in its original purpose: mutual protection, shared knowledge, and genuine cooperation. What we reject is the parasitic control of the Lumina Empire." She gestured at the displays, which now showed draft documents. "We propose a réforme d'alliance, a return to the original Republic's principles, adapted for our current era. Equal representation, technological sharing with appropriate safeguards determined by consensus, not imperial decree. Fair resource exchange based on mutual benefit." The Emperor, seeing control slipping away, made one final desperate attempt. This is sedition. Any world that supports this human plot will face the full might of the Empire. Rostova looked at him with what appeared to be genuine pity. Your empire just had its fleet neutralized by a single human tactic you never saw coming. A tactic we developed in less than a year after your resource directive was announced. Her expression hardened. Imagine what the combined ingenuity of hundreds of species working together could accomplish if freed from your restrictions. She turned back to the Senate. We're transmitting these historical records and our proposal for a reformed alliance to every world simultaneously. We ask each species to consider it carefully and send representatives to Earth in 30 standard cycles for a constitutional convention. Then she did something completely unexpected. She walked directly up to Emperor Kalen VII, who stood frozen in shock and rage. Without ceremony, without hesitation, she grabbed the elaborately embroidered collar of his ceremonial robes and pulled. The emperor, caught completely off guard, stumbled forward. When he resisted, Rostova simply increased her pull, dragging him from his elevated platform and onto the main floor of the Senate. "What are you doing?" he hissed, his voice for once stripped of its artificial resonance, sounding merely like a confused individual rather than a godlike ruler. "Creating a symbol," Rostova replied simply, continuing to pull him across the floor, past the still unconscious admiral. Vash, toward the great doors of the Senate. The entire chamber watched in stunned silence. The royal guards made half-hearted movements to intervene, but were blocked by the crowd of ambassadors who had now surrounded the spectacle, witnessing what had been unthinkable mere moments before. The Emperor of the Lumina, ruler of the Galactic Alliance for over 5,000 years, being physically dragged across the Senate floor by a human captain. I followed, as did many others, maintaining a respectful distance, but unwilling to miss this historic moment. Through the grand corridors of the Senate complex we proceeded, the human pulling the increasingly resigned emperor past startled officials, maintenance workers, and security personnel who could only stare in disbelief. The procession finally reached a small conference room that appeared to have been prepared in advance. Inside waited a small team of humans in various uniforms, surrounded by holographic displays and communication equipment. "What is the meaning of this final indignity?" the emperor demanded, attempting to reassert his authority despite his disheveled appearance. "This," said Rostova, finally releasing his collar, "is where we negotiate the terms of transition. Not your execution, not your imprisonment, but the peaceful transformation of the Empire into the Reformed Alliance." She gestured to the seats arranged around a circular table. "Equality begins with symbol, Emperor Kalen. You will sit as an equal with representatives of the species you've subjugated for millennia." The emperor stared at the simple chair indicated. "And if I refuse? Then you become irrelevant to the process," Rostova said simply. "The transition will proceed without Lumina input, which would be unfortunate for your people." For several tense moments, it seemed the emperor would indeed refuse. Then, with a barely perceptible shift in his posture, he moved to the indicated seat and sat down. The negotiations lasted for 16 grueling days. I was invited to participate as a neutral mediator, along with representatives from 12 major alliance species. The human delegation, led by Captain Rostova and a team of diplomats who had apparently been waiting in secret on Xylos, presented evidence, historical analyses, and proposals with remarkable thoroughness. The emperor, after his initial resistance, engaged with surprising pragmatism. Perhaps he recognized that total defeat could still be mitigated through cooperation. Or perhaps, as some later suggested, the revelations about Lumina origins had affected him more deeply than he admitted. The final document, which would come to be known as the Xylos Reformation Accord, represented a complete restructuring of galactic governance. The Lumina Empire would transition to the status of a member species, retaining their homeworlds and colonies, but surrendering direct control over other worlds. A galactic council with rotating leadership would replace imperial governance, with representation proportional to population, but with safeguards to prevent any single species from dominating. Historical archives would be made public, with a Truth and Reconciliation Commission established to address millennia of Lumina manipulation and control. Technology sharing would be governed by a multi-species regulatory body, with restrictions based solely on demonstrable harm potential rather than imperial prerogative. Resource allocation would be renegotiated on principles of fair exchange and sustainable development. When the Emperor finally affixed his bioelectric signature to the document, the transmission was broadcast throughout the Alliance. The image that accompanied it, the Emperor seated as an equal with representatives of formerly subjugated species, was powerful, but it was overshadowed by the recordings of his being dragged through the Senate halls, which had already spread through communication networks with unstoppable velocity. The galaxy had indeed watched in silence, but now it spoke, and its voice was a complex chorus of liberation, uncertainty, vindication, and concern. In the months that followed, I observed the initial implementation of the Accord with cautious optimism. Human diplomatic and technical teams arrived on numerous worlds, working alongside local leaders to establish new governance structures. The transition was not without conflict. Several Lumina military commanders attempted resistance, only to discover that the humans had shared nullifier technology with key Alliance worlds as insurance. Most surprising was the reaction of many ordinary Lumina citizens, who seemed almost relieved by the revelations about their origins. A significant Reformation movement emerged within their society, led by younger Lumina who embraced their true history rather than the imperial mythology. One standard year after what was now commonly called the Dragging, I found myself on Earth for the first formal session of the new Galactic Council. The humans had constructed a circular amphitheater for the proceedings, intentionally distinct from the hierarchical arrangement of the old Senate. As I watched representatives from hundreds of worlds take their places, including former Emperor Kalen VII, now simply the Lumina delegate, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary chain of events that had led to this moment. Captain Rostova, now Ambassador Rostova, approached me during a recess. "You look thoughtful, Ambassador Lyra," she observed. "I am considering the nature of power," I replied. "And symbols." She nodded. "The dragging." "Yes. You knew exactly what you were doing, didn't you?" It wasn't an emotional outburst or a personal humiliation. It was a calculated symbolic act. "Of course," she acknowledged without pretense. "For 5,000 years, the Lumina maintained control not just through military force, but through the perception of inherent superiority, that they were untouchable, almost divine. We needed to shatter that perception completely and irrevocably, with a single physical act that would be recorded and remembered forever," I said. "Humans understand the power of symbolic moments," she said. "Sometimes, a physical truth cuts through where facts and arguments cannot reach." I considered this. Many still fear that humans will simply become the new Lumina, that you will use your adaptability and tactical thinking to establish a new empire. Rostova smiled slightly. "A reasonable concern, but there's a fundamental difference, which is, humans never claim to be perfect or unchanging. We know our flaws intimately. We fight among ourselves constantly. We question everything, including ourselves." She gestured to the council chamber, where human delegates could be seen vigorously debating with each other despite ostensibly representing the same world. "That's our greatest strength and our built-in limitation. We're constitutionally incapable of the kind of unified, millennia-spanning deception the Lumina maintained." I wasn't entirely convinced, but I appreciated her candor. As the new council session began, I watched the diverse representatives finding their way through new protocols and relationships. The future remained uncertain. The Reformed Alliance faced enormous challenges, healing ancient wounds, integrating disparate technologies, establishing trust across species that had been manipulated into rivalry for thousands of years. Yet there was also unprecedented opportunity. Already, the removal of Lumina restrictions had led to remarkable innovations as species freely shared knowledge for the first time. Worlds long marginalized were finding their voices. Ancient cultures were rediscovering lost histories. And at the center of it all were the humans, adaptable, aggressive, creative, contradictory, and now inextricably woven into the fabric of galactic civilization. The species that had dared to drag an emperor through the halls of power while the galaxy watched in silence. The silence had ended. A new conversation had begun. Whether it would lead to a golden age of genuine cooperation or merely a more complex form of conflict remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: the galaxy would never be the same again. As I raised my voice to address the Council on behalf of the Sylvani, I felt for the first time in my diplomatic career that I was truly speaking to equals.